For the remaining problems in the chapter, we're going to work just one single problem so that we can get an idea of how each different decision rule applies to the same project, and then we'll be better able to compare and contrast how the different projects work, how the different decision rules apply, and what makes them better or worse in different situations. So the project that we're going to look at for the rest of the chapter is this one. It has an initial cost of $165,000 and then 3 years of cash flows: $63,120, $70,800, $91,080, and then some other information that we don't need for the net present value rule, like net income or average book value, but we will use with our other decision rules. So I want to leave it here to be consistent. The required return for assets at this risk level is 12%. This is our discount rate. Again, we have our two questions. What's the net present value? So what's the result of our decision rule? And based on the decision rule itself, do we accept or reject the project? So we could write out a little timeline of our cash flows. Here we have a shorter project. We only have 3 years worth of cash flows. Our initial cost is $165,000. 3 years of positive cash flows here: $63,120, $70,800, $91,080. I marked all these as negative because those are positive cash flows. So just like the first example, I could take the present values of the cash flows individually. Present value of the first cash flow would be $56,357.14. I could take the present value of the second cash flow, $56,441.33. Present value of the third cash flow, $64,840.24. I could add those together, the sum of the present values of the future cash flows, and then subtract the cost, which is $165,000. If I do that, I get a net present value of $12,628.70. And so we take the project. Net present value rule says any NPV greater than 0 is an acceptable project. However, of course, we don't need to do it by hand. We can use the calculator. Either the graphing calculator or the financial calculator will work just fine. Here, I'll show you the financial calculator again, and I'll write it out. So if we're going to solve with the calculator, we are using the cash flow environment. And the cash flow environment is using the cash flow buttons, right next to the second button. So here we press the cash flow button to get into the environment, and then we need to clear our work from any previous problems by pressing second and the clear button, where the clear button is clear work. Then we proceed to enter our cash flow, starting with CF0, where CF0 is the initial cash flow, and the initial cash flow is always the cost. So the cost is $165,000, but remember that in the calculator we need to treat a cost as a cash outflow, and the calculator wants us to say cash outflows are negative. So we make this cash flow negative, and then we set the value in the environment using the enter button. We can move on then with the down arrow. The next thing we'll see is C01, where C01 is the first cash flow, and the first cash flow is the first positive cash flow we have, $63,120. This is a cash inflow, so we leave it as a positive value, and we set it with the enter button, and we move on with the down arrow. The next thing we see is F01, and remember that F, or all of the F's in the cash flow environment, stand for frequency of the previous entered cash flow. And the frequency of the first cash flow is 1, because frequency means how many times does the cash flow repeat in a row. Here it doesn't repeat at all, so we leave it at the default value, which is 1. We just press down. Next we see C02, which is the second cash flow, and the second cash flow is $70,800. We set that value with the enter button, and move on using the down arrow. Once again, we leave the frequency of the second cash flow, F02, at its default value. We don't do anything and we press down. C03, in this problem, the third cash flow is also the final cash flow, and that value is 91,080. And once we've entered the final cash flow in any of these problems, we can stop and we can simply move on to solving for whatever we're interested in, either the net present value or the internal rate of return. Here we want the net present value, so we press the NPV button and we see I equals. And we use I here is our discount rate, and our discount rate is our required return for assets of this risk level, which is 12%. We enter 12%. Remember, we're using a percentage in the calculator, not a decimal. We set that value with the enter button, and we move on with the down arrow. You'll next see net present value equals, and here's where we solve. Simply press the compute button and see that we get 12,627.41. And again, there's no difference here, no functional difference. You'll see that those values are slightly different, and that's because when I solved it by hand, I rounded each of my intermediate steps to 2 digits. And when the calculator solves it, it doesn't do any rounding at the intermediate steps, and so you'll notice that this is a slightly different number. Functionally, though, these are the same, and we still are going to make the same decision, which is to accept. I will tend to solve problems using this methodology, and we won't do any by hand anymore. So make sure that you're using the least amount of rounding at your intermediate steps so that you come up with the same answer that I do, which is to accept this project. I can show you again how we do this using the calculator. Right? We start off by pressing the cash flow button. We have our previous problem in here, so we clear those values using second and clear button. CF0 is our initial cash flow, which is $165,000. This is the cost of the project. Because it's a cost, it's a cash outflow, and the calculator treats cash outflows as negative values. So we make that value a negative and we press enter. We move on with the down arrow and we see C01, which is the first cash flow. And the first cash flow is $63,120. We set that value with the enter. We move on with the down arrow. F01, again, this is just the frequency of that cash flow. It only happens one time, so the default is fine. We move on with the down arrow to C02, the second cash flow, $70,800. We set that value with the enter button. We move on. The frequency is left at its default. The frequency of that cash flow is 1. And we go to our third and final cash flow, $91,080. We set that value with the enter button. And again, once we've entered our final cash flow here in these problems, we just move on to whatever we're solving for. So we move on to net present value here. I is our discount rate, and our discount rate is the required rate of return. That's 12%. We enter it as a percent, the whole number. We press the down arrow to get to net present value, and we press compute to solve, and we get 12,627.41. And we take this project.